All right, so we've addressed the first two popular conceptions of philosophy: the quest for truth regarding ultimate matters and theorizing about the meaning of the good life for human beings. Now let's briefly consider a third popular conception of philosophy: the association of philosophy with the college experience. So the tradition of philosophy is very often encountered for the first time as, pardon the language, the sort of mindfuck class you take in college, right? In other words, philosophy class is often the first time that young people will begin questioning seriously and systematically many of the beliefs they've grown up accepting as true, discovering that they may not, in fact, actually believe what they've grown up always believing is true. Now, because some philosophical arguments can cause psychological discomfort, some students will try to insulate themselves from the questioning attitude, right? Closing their mind to questions that challenge their core beliefs. Of course, at the same time, there are plenty of students who are excited to discover that the big questions of life, which they've always wanted to ask but have sort of been habituated not to ask, are often the very same questions addressed by the world's most influential thinkers. And the best critical thinking classes, the best college classes in general, will expose you to a style of education that will make you fall in love with your own intellectual development. Fall in love with the project of becoming yourself and constructing your consciousness, instead of having it constructed for you by authority. And if you can't get excited about that, right? If you can't get excited about education, I promise you it's because you've never actually experienced education, even if you've been in school for the past 12 years. As one of my favorite philosophers put it, right? The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be lighted. And anyone who said they were trying to educate you or teach you critical thinking and then merely tried to fill up your mind with information to memorize were not actually educating you, right? They were mistreating you in some sense. They were harming you, teaching many students to hate that very thing which is essential for human liberation and human flourishing: education and critical thinking. Right? Thriving as a student, it's not about getting all A's. It's learning how to multiply your curiosities and loves and fascinations and talents. The professors who inspire you and ignite your desires for personal growth, this is what thriving in college is about, right? Encountering those folks, encountering the big, bold ideas that change you from the inside out, and the critical thinking tools that help you to examine your world as you discern what you want from it and for it. And so these ideas and the feeling I'm trying to drive at here all feed into the final definition of philosophy that I shared in the last video, right? Defining philosophy as a unique style of consciousness, right? In other words, a particular way of thinking and perceiving and existing in the world. A way of thinking and perceiving that is distinct from ordinary everyday consciousness. Right? Ordinary everyday consciousness takes for granted the legitimacy of the world on offer, simply accepting the world and its basic arrangements as normal, natural, preferable, inevitable, and necessary. Right? So ordinary consciousness looks at the world on offer for it and says, oh, this is just the way things are. Philosophical consciousness, on the other hand, it begins with a skepticism about the assumed legitimacy of the world that's on offer, along with all of the institutions that arrange it, right? In other words, it brings against the world an attitude of radical questioning, right? This does not, though, mean that all philosophers are inherently social or political radicals, but they start with a kind of radical questioning of the accepted traditions, institutions, ideas, and even the world itself that's on offer for us. And so one of our goals for this critical thinking class, therefore, is to learn to inhabit a philosophical consciousness, to be as critical as possible when examining ourselves and our beliefs about the world and our use of reasoning to understand the world and its arrangements, right? Of course, our world is very messy and complex. Attempts to understand the world are often full of oversimplification, inherited biases, empty political rhetoric, state, media propaganda, misunderstandings of history, just confusion, contradiction, groupthink, herd mentality, cognitive biases, impoverished political imaginations, the Overton window, and overall poor critical thinking skills, right? And these are all obstacles to truth and to reason. So ignorance is just perpetuated from everywhere, from our friends, our family, our teachers, our role models, our politicians, news pundits, and maybe above all, right, our social media feeds. And, as we all know, this is a world that was facing a number of crises, right? It's a world that is still in many ways plagued by a deadly global pandemic, right? Caused by a virus that's even now, the third leading cause of death in the US, right? A pandemic that governments and citizens alike utterly failed to control, right? And as a result, it took only 2 years for COVID to kill as many Americans, a million Americans, right? Twice the population of Atlanta, Georgia, right? It killed more people in 2 years than the AIDS epidemic killed in 40 years, right? And of course, for the longest time, maybe still, 1/3 of Americans simply didn't believe these numbers, right? It's a world that is reeling under ecological collapse as the devastating consequences of climate change threaten the continuation of organized life on the planet, promising to turn hundreds of millions of people into refugees fleeing uninhabitable zones. Right, we're witnessing a major species die-off in the biosphere, what climatologists identify as Earth's 6th mass extinction event. Meanwhile, wildfires driven by heat and drought are burning hundreds of thousands of acres across the US, Canada, Russia, and Southern Europe. The glaciers continue to melt, sea levels then continue to rise, salmon are being scorched to death in the rivers, and big oil corporations are setting fire to the fucking oceans at the same time, right? This is a world haunted once again by the specter of a world at war. The rise and fall of superpowers, energy and resource depletion, food insecurity, and worldwide economic instability. Back home, the United States, no longer the lone superpower, is gripped by social unrest along racial, class, and political lines as the country seems to inch closer and closer to civil war, constitutional crisis, waning judicial legitimacy, and authoritarian coups d'etats. And what's contributed to much of this unrest is the fact that for the last 40 years, the US has reeled under astounding levels of incarceration, disproportionately devastating the lives of Black and poor communities. The rate of incarceration has simply been unprecedented, right, in the history of the world. And the US currently has less than 5% of the world's population, but yet over 25% of the world's prisoners. Staggering wealth and resource exploitation ravages the world economy as mass poverty and starvation exist right alongside unfathomable opulence and wealth. Right, 84% of all of the stocks on Wall Street are owned by less than 10% of the population. In other words, the bulk of the US economy is owned by a very small percentage of people, right? Sometimes referred to as the 1%. I mean, in fact, during the pandemic, when unemployment skyrocketed, the wealth of the world's 25 richest people grew by $255 billion. At the same time, more than 1 in 5 children are at risk of hunger in the United States alone, right? And among Black and Latino children, the rate is sometimes as high as 1 in 3. Much of our world has fallen under the growing influence of powerful transnational corporations, right? Mega corporations, which can wield as much power as a sovereign country, right? They scour the poorest places on earth in search of the cheapest possible labor, pay slave wages to the men, women, and children whose blood and sweat make the commodities that then find their way into our retail stores. Right? Of course, the working conditions in these factories are hidden from the consumers, right, who often continue to consume in a sort of blissful ignorance of the exploitation and sometimes child labor occurring, right, in those factories or in those sweatshops, etc. Lastly, right, our world is one where vast numbers of people are connected with one another virtually at all times through social media, yet more and more our family and our friends suffer from isolation, anxiety, depression, and a sort of generalized mental health misery, as the suicide rate in the US has increased 33% since the late 1990s. Right? And so these are just a few of the kind of crises and contradictions of the world that's on offer for you. It's a world that continues to spiral into deep intellectual confusion, political chaos, social uncertainty, and ecological ruin, but also in some corners, revolution. And some philosophy only interprets the world. But as one famous philosopher put it, right, the point is to change it, to create a world that can actually meet our desires for beauty, justice, truth, and goodness, right? And in fact, this was the guiding orientation of philosophy at its inception, right? 2,000 years ago with Socrates, the founder of Western philosophy. All right, so that's it for this lecture. I'll hopefully have another one posted soon that covers the text, the nature of philosophy, and then a few more on the allegory of the cave. Thanks.